Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes, yes, yes. Is that a yes? Okay. These audiences are always so quiet and polite, which we love, of course. I'm LaShawn Jefferson. I'm the Senior Executive Director here at Perry Worldhouse. And it's really wonderful to see all of you on this late afternoon on what I believe is still a Thursday. As many of you know, and some of you might not know, we're Penn's hub for global engagement, which means that we are home for Penn faculty, staff, student, alum, and those of you from the West Philadelphia community who are engaged in global issues. And we're, again, really happy to see you here. We also think, therefore, that it's quite fitting that with our colleagues at the Andrea Mitchell Center, we are launching Democracy and Emergent Technology Series, a year-long program of panels and talks that will explore the various intersections of technology and politics. So it's my very great pleasure to invite to the stage Jeffrey Green, a Penn Professor of Political Science and Director of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy here at Penn. Jeff and his team at the Andrea Mitchell Center have worked tirelessly to make the programs a success. So of course, thank you, Jeff. But before Jeff takes the stage, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge Tom Shattuck. Where are you hiding, Tom? Oh, there, right there, who is the program manager for the Future of the Global Order theme within Perry Worldhouse, who's also been working diligently to make sure that this series is both compelling and thoughtful. Jeff will now provide additional context and information on this monthly series and introduce our wonderful guest, Jessica Brandt, and our moderator, Mitch Orenstein. So thank you, and you are welcome to the stage. I don't need a
Hi, everyone. Good to be here this afternoon. Thank you, LaShawn, and thank you, Tom, for all your work as partners putting together, especially the event this afternoon and the rest of the series that will unfold over the course of this academic year. We're very delighted to have Perry Worldhouse as a partner, to be able to use your beautiful space the entire academic year, and to be able to collaborate with you. Today's a very special event for the Andrea Mitchell Center because we're not only having an important discussion on authoritarian disinformation, but in doing so, we're launching the series on democracy and emergent technology. I want to thank the planning committee that for over a year has worked to envision and execute the series, Anita Allen from Penn's Law School, Ellen Goodman from Rutgers Law, Michael Horowitz from Perry Worldhouse in Political Science, who can't be here this year because he's directing the Emerging Capabilities Policy Office at the Department of Defense, very much engaged with emergent technologies. Vijay Kumar, the Dean of Penn Engineering, Susan Lindy from History and Sociology of Science at Penn, Jessa Lingell from the Annenberg School for Communication at Penn, Benjamin Shestakovsky from Sociology at Penn, my colleague Matt Roth in the Mitchell Center, and Christopher Yu from Penn Law. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Xavier Flory, who is the postdoctoral fellow connected with this series on democracy and emergent technologies. Xavier recently received his PhD from Columbia and Sciences Po, a double PhD. So someone who knows, I guess, what a lot of work is like. Congrats on finishing that. And he's returning to Penn, where he received his BA in history about a decade ago. So thank you, Xavier. We look forward to working with you and are so happy to have you with us this year. I think the topic of the series in the broadest sense is fairly straightforward. We're living in, I think, an undisputed technological revolution. I don't think it's hyperbolic to describe the changes technologically we've been going through as revolutionary, and as revolutionary as any other moment of technological change in human history. And what we want to do is explore the consequences of this revolution for democratic values, values of equality, inclusion, participation, and autonomy, among others. Now, if the topic is straightforward, I'm not sure the answers are. They're difficult, they're complicated, and so we're delighted to have with us throughout the year a distinguished array of speakers, academics, journalists, activists, and so forth, who can shed light on the various issues that we'll be investigating together over the next many months. These issues include what it might mean to democratize the internet, the potential benefits and drawbacks of smart cities for sustainability and civic engagement, the role of race in shaping the often disparate impacts of technology, the way that finance has been altered and potentially democratized by the emergence of blockchain, cryptocurrency, meme stocks, and NFTs, among other developments, the complex relationship between warfare and technological development, and how the world of work is being impacted by digitalization and other technological changes. These are some of the topics we'll be exploring in the months ahead, but now we turn to today's topic, how new technologies have shaped the propaganda and disinformation propagated by authoritarian regimes. And we're delighted to have with us today Jessica Brandt, who comes to us from the Brookings Institution, where she is Policy Director for the Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative. She's also a fellow at the Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology, which is part of Brookings' foreign policy program. Her areas of expertise include foreign interference, disinformation, digital authoritarianism, and more generally, the implications of emerging technologies for liberal democracies. So she couldn't be more relevant to our overall theme this year. She's also the lead author of a report stemming from a bipartisan task force of 30 leading national security practitioners. This report, How Democracies Can Offset Autocratic Advances, came out in 2020, and we distributed it on the website, and hopefully you got a copy of that. I think it's really informative and suggests how certain asymmetries in the structure of authoritarian regimes vis-a-vis democratic ones can, at least in the short term, make liberal democracies vulnerable to authoritarian disinformation and other forms of aggression, but also how these challenges and threats can be resisted. And I'll just add that Jessica Brandt has been widely published and quoted in leading journalistic outlets from across the world. And so we're delighted to have her with us today. And she'll be speaking in conversation with Mitchell Orenstein, who many of you know is a highly visible and prolific scholar at Penn in the Russian and East European Studies Department. I won't go through all of Mitchell's many accomplishments, but I'll just signal one of his recent works, which I can't recommend enough, his 2019, The Lands in Between, Russia versus the West and the New Politics of Hybrid War. Written before the current version of the Ukraine crisis, the book is quite prescient and helpful in conceptualizing some of the challenges that the world is dealing with at the moment. It discusses with some historical sweep why it is that Russia turned against the West, how it has done so, how liberal democracies in Western Europe and the United States have tried to resist these encroachments, and perhaps most interestingly, how the politics of countries in between Western Europe and Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Moldova, and other places, is not only being affected by these cross pressures, but how their politics are in some ways predictive of developments that are happening now in Western Europe and in the United States. It's very accessible, it's very informative. I really recommend that book to you. So with that said, let me just welcome to the stage Jessica Brandt and Mitchell Orenstein. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me with you today. It's great to be here. So I was asked to say a few words about how autocrats have utilized information campaigns to shape public opinion and discourse in democratic countries around the globe. What kind of tactics are they using, why it matters, and what we can do about it. And I want to first situate the challenge in what I would describe as a persistent asymmetric competition between democracies and authoritarian challengers that I think is taking place across at least 4 interconnected non-military domains. These are politics, and here I'm thinking primarily, but not solely, about interference in democratic processes and efforts to denigrate democratic governments. Economics, the accumulation and application of coercive leverage, and the use of strategic corruption. Technology, which I think intersects with all other domains of competition, but it's a competitive domain in its own right. And information, which I think might be among the most consequential terrain over which states are going to compete in the decades to come, and that's where I'm going to focus today. Let me just say quickly, Russia and China are operating from very different strategic positions and trajectories. They're operating on different time horizons with different tolerances for risk toward different long-term goals. Russia is, a declining power, and so to compensate for its relative weakness, it's working to disrupt the alliances, institutions, and domestic politics of competitor states, and to do so in the near term. It has, I think, little to lose and perhaps something to gain from public awareness of its activities. And so the Kremlin's not particularly sensitive to attribution. And as a result, its interference activities generally and its information activities, specifically, they tend to be destructive, aimed at promoting disarray with little concern for the repercussions. The Kremlin does not seek to attract audiences to Russia or to promote even a particular worldview, but rather to promote the idea that there just is no such thing as objective truth. China, on the other hand, is, I think, pursuing a more subtle long-term strategy. I think, it prefers a stable order, just one that's more conducive to its interests. And therefore, it seeks to promote its own image as a responsible global player and to stifle criticism that would suggest otherwise. It's a rising power. It has a lot to lose from having its engagement in information operations exposed. And so it's traditionally been more sensitive to attribution, although I think there's some evidence that that's changing. Despite these important differences, I think Russia and China share at least three objectives: undermining the legitimacy of liberal democratic systems and governments as a means of shoring up their own illiberal ones, stifling criticism from foreign individuals or governments and preventing them from coordinating to counter their interests, and weakening global alliances, partnerships, and institutions that could constrain their activities. So as a result, they share several of the same narratives, targets, and tactics. I think both frequently rely on whataboutism to paint the United States as hypocritical, especially on issues of race. Both have built followings on Twitter by skillfully blending strategic messaging with the kinds of content that are sort of meant to connect with Western audiences. Both have deployed multiple, at times conflicting conspiracy theories to deflect blame for their own activities and to undermine the notion of an objective truth. And both invest large sums in propaganda outfits that target overseas audiences. And at some point, I'd love to talk through respective tradecraft and how I see it changing, but maybe just in the interest of time, I would highlight a few evolving tactics that I think are relevant to policymakers. From Russia, I think we're seeing an increasing emphasis on co-opting authentic domestic voices and institutions, journalists and activists, to disguise operations as authentic advocacy. This is doing things like co-locating trolls in a target population, which they've done in multiple locations in Africa, or renting social media accounts of local actors, which they did in Ukraine ahead of previous elections there. Or hiring real journalists to write for online journalists, which they did right here at home ahead of 2020. And the Kremlin pursues this approach because it complicates detection efforts and because it limits the response options that are available both to platforms and to governments, because it triggers, as it should, constitutional protections on speech and a set of complicated political dynamics. Another key trend is sort of using the truth to tell a lie, or pursuing malinformation strategies, which is sort of this reliance on factual but misleading information that can shape public perceptions over time, but is extraordinarily difficult to fact check or to moderate. So we see this on vaccines, right? Rather than promote verifiably false information, what Moscow does is sensationalize reports of safety concerns and then downplays mitigating context. And I think broadly speaking, we're witnessing this shift away from a reliance on large volumes of troll farm content that's generated by proxies towards more targeted operations that are likely carried out by military intelligence. And I think this is a very different challenge than we faced in 2016 when we were sort of caught flat-footed, or in 2018 when the sort of, challenge was largely driven by the IRA. And I think these changes are occurring partly to evade, increasingly sophisticated detection mechanisms on the part of the platforms. But I think they're occurring for a more fundamental reason, which is that the Kremlin does not need to rely on large volumes of troll farm content to upend U.S. domestic politics with corrosive, narratives about, we're doing that to ourselves. And I think this is perhaps the sort of greatest coup of Russia's 2016 operation, which is that it sort of fueled this wave of partisan convulsions over election legitimacy that I think reverberates today. There's lots of discussion about the ways in which China's wolf warriors are drawing on Russia's playbook, especially in the context of the pandemic. And I think that's true, but I would highlight that Beijing has developed several unique plays of its own that I think warrant our attention. The first is manufacturing the sort of appearance of popular backing. Russia uses false personas to seed polarizing and divisive narratives. China uses them to make it look like there's an army of netizens that agree with pro-China positions. On Twitter, China's diplomats regularly engage with accounts that bear multiple hallmarks of inauthenticity. And this is either just like a totally stunning lack of digital literacy, or I think a more coordinated effort to manufacture this appearance of consensus. Russian diplomats almost never engage with suspicious accounts. That's not what they do. And I just think this underscores the challenge of generating grassroots support for its campaigns on a platform that it bans at home. The other is co-opting critical conversations about its rights record using hashtag campaigns, things like hashtag real life Xinjiang, and other tactics to crowd out criticism with positive content, like slick travel videos and purported re-education success stories. So where Moscow's information strategies focused on discrediting the West rather than attracting audiences to Russia, China is considerably more focused on softening how it's perceived. Russian state media almost never covers Russian domestic issues. China's, by contrast, is proactively promoting a positive image of the country and its governance model. Anyway, I think there's also an interesting conversation to be had about the use of influencers. Until recently, lacking an influencer network of its own, Beijing really relied on the sort of propaganda apparatuses of other strongmen. But I think there's growing evidence that it is building its own capabilities on that front. So anyway, that's their strategy, or some of it. And I think we need a strategy to push back on these activities. I think it should emphatically not include responding to information manipulation with our own deceptive campaigns, which France was revealed to have done in Africa late last year. And I think there's now some question about whether the United States has undertaken a similar effort. I think that approach just enables autocrats to dictate the terms of the competition, and it all but ensures that the contest plays out on a terrain where we are at a disadvantage. Because I think we need to remember that autocrats, they choose these tools because even as open information spaces confer, I think, important advantages to democracies over the long run, as my colleague said, they create vulnerabilities in the short term. And I think, democracy depends on the idea that the truth is knowable, that citizens can discern it, that they can use it for the purpose of self-government. And I think, when democratic governments pollute the information space with manipulated content, they risk eroding these ideas and the authority of their own institutions. And I think they ultimately do more harm to themselves than their competitors. Because autocrats have no such need for a healthy information space to thrive. They can pollute the information commons with, I think, very little concern about eroding the strength of their own institutions. And in fact, maybe the opposite, that autocrats are vulnerable to the free flow of information that might expose their failures. And they benefit from widespread public skepticism that the truth exists at all. So I think instead, democracy should go on offense in the spaces that are most conducive to their own success. To start with, I think democracies can seize the initiative by harnessing truthful information to defend their interests and the integrity of the global information environment. And so I think to do this, we need to sort of take the persistent engagement approach that we've applied to cyberspace and carry it into the information domain. This would involve concerted campaigns to expose the failures of dictatorship. I have maybe a lot to say about how this has played out in the context of Ukraine, and maybe we'll have time to get to that. But I think this is broadly an approach that's in keeping with a strategy of pushing back on Moscow and Beijing's advances by exploiting their weaknesses, because competition is ultimately about the pursuit and use of advantages. And then I think, democracies should also uphold freedom of information worldwide, in part because it's consistent with democratic principles, but also because it puts Russia and China in a defensive position, given their fragility to open information. And I think this strategy should include investments in local and independent media at home and supporting objective media abroad, especially in closed or closing spaces, because robust civil societies and robust news ecosystems really speak truth to power and keep citizens informed. And I think ultimately defending democratic interests in the information domain is going to require thinking beyond the information domain, that we can use diplomatic and economic tools at our disposal to impose costs that might, deter authoritarians from conducting information operations. So strengths like the centrality of our markets that would enable us to impose sanctions that might have bite, or cyber capabilities, to deter this kind of activity, right? Cybercom took the IRA offline for a few days around the 2018 midterms. It sent teams, abroad ahead of 2020 to anticipate how adversaries might target that election. These are the kinds of tools and strengths that we can use. So anyway, I could keep going, but let me just say, I think democratic governments should do all of this in partnership with one another, recognizing that this is ultimately a contest over principles, and that I think a strong network of partnerships is actually perhaps one of the democracy's greatest advantages. Thanks.
Thank you for that presentation. That was really, really comprehensive and interesting. Can everybody hear me? Am I projected? Okay, great. So I'm Mitchell Orenstein from the Russian and East European Studies Department, Political Science here at Penn. And it's my pleasure to be able to ask Jessica Brandt a few questions about what she's just said. Now, you talk a lot about, the core piece, I think, of your work has been about authoritarian governments and the way that they use disinformation, essentially, with a focus on Russia and China, although I think you're talking about some other places as well. Can you give us some examples of disinformation campaigns by Russia and China or others that have been really, really successful? Like, what kind of threat actually does this pose?
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe a place to start, I'm happy to give specific examples, but it's really hard to know. It is really hard to evaluate what kinds of campaigns, whether campaigns are successful, because ultimately you're talking about a counterfactual. And so I think so it's hard to say. And because these campaigns are often like quite sophisticated about drawing on sort of threads, arguments, and sentiments that already exist in a target society and amplifying them. And so did Russia's efforts to stoke, partisan division and chaos, not just in 2016, but, ongoing today. We could talk about what happened over the Roe decision, for example. Did that sort of shift public opinion in the United States 10%, 15%, 20%? I don't know. I don't know that that's knowable. And I sort of don't know that it's my role to say. But I think, I think there's a lot of focus on how these campaigns target elections. And I think, elections are flashpoints, but they're not the start or the end points of these campaigns that target all kinds of polarizing political events and happen in ways that I think are often not quite visible. So a piece of recent research that, I worked on with some colleagues at Brookings looked at how, China's able to be quite successful at surfacing, its state-backed content in search results for even the neutral term Xinjiang, right? Like we found that when you, search the neutral place name Xinjiang, in 98% of searches on YouTube and in 88% of searches on, on Google and Bing News, you're getting Chinese state-backed content that quite often, downplays or dismisses claims of human rights abuses there. And often this content, is sort of, it's not labeled, it's appearing without context. So that's just an example to show that it's not all about elections, that it happens not just on social media platforms, that it's shaping our information environment in ways that aren't wholly visible to us, and that it's not all about sort of stoking our partisan division. Some of it is about sort of shaping views over the long run in ways that it's really hard to quantify or calculate, like what is the cumulative effect.
That's really interesting, right? Because then it sort of raises this question, are we chasing a phantom, right? Or, how do we quantify or what even should we be concerned about, right? And I wonder, just posing that question a slightly different way, there are obviously government agencies like in the West, right, that are concerned with this, right? You said maybe it's not your place to say what the concern is. What are they concerned about? Like, what are the things that they're worried about?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a considerable evidence that there's like a very complex interplay between our domestic information environment and what's coming from foreign actors. And the way I see it, or the way I would characterize it, is actually this sort of mutual game of improv, right? Like the bioweapons conspiracy, for example, which Russia and then later China actually promoted to a greater extent than even Russia. This actually was not originally a Russian conspiracy theory. This originated on, a far right platform in the United States. It was, it was a homegrown conspiracy right here, that was incubated right here, and that, the Russians picked up, iterated on, and then, fed back into our information environment. And then, Tucker Carlson, did a segment on it. And, again, some researchers that I work with documented how, that led to an explosion of content on just the popular political podcast ecosystem here in the United States that sort of either didn't challenge or reiterated the conspiracy theory, right? It's corrosive. But it's complex. Like who started it is sort of almost an impossible question to untangle. And I think that's the case in many of these information campaigns. So what do I think, our sort of leadership or, that the government, our government is worried about? And also, I mean, I myself am worried about, I think it's the erosion of this sort of shared sense that there is the sort of widespread, the nihilism about the truth, the sort of like skepticism that the truth exists at all, is a pretty dangerous place to be. And so, I think, again, it's not about any one individual like information campaign, but about the combined effects. And this question of like, are we chasing a phantom is a really important one. I mean, we didn't talk about this I didn't get to this in my remarks, but perception hacking is another sort of key Russian trend, which is like taking advantage of our, expectation that manipulation, especially in an election context, might happen in order to claim that it has, even when it hasn't. So like in 2018, you had a bunch of Russians contacted a bunch of American journalists saying, with some spreadsheets that said, here we're giving you in advance the results of anyway, they claimed the existence of this like widespread effort to hack the midterms that didn't exist. And I think a happy story is that like journalists worked with a bunch of civil society experts to kind of figure out that this was all bunk and didn't fall for the bait and publicize it. But how destructive would it have been if they had? And like, why do we think that Russia probed election systems in all 50 states in 2016? It was because they were preparing for a disinformation operation if they hadn't won. Or if the preferred candidate hadn't won, that again would sort of draw on this like anticipation of manipulation to claim like widespread success, even if they didn't change a single vote. And I think we see this happening too, with narratives around like big tech censorship, for example. That's a place where Russia loves to press, right? Because there's like a whole politics around. There's a whole sort of contested discourse around disinformation and whether it exists and sort of is it in the eye of the beholder, and that too is sort of very fertile ground, for Russia to sort of tread.
So can I push a little bit more on that? Just we talked a bit about this briefly, but I'm really curious to hear your perspective on this. There was an attempt by the U.S. government, actually a creation of a U.S. government agency. I think it was called the Disinformation Board within the DHS, Department of Homeland Security. And can you tell us that story and why that seems to have been like an absolute failure?
Yeah, it's a painful question. It was called the Disinformation Governance Board, which I think is even worse. And I think the idea of the board was a good one, right? I mean, the idea was that the Department of Homeland Security had an interest in understanding, threats in the information space, conversations related to extremism. When you think about what the agency does, right, it's protecting elections. So it had a sort of legitimate interest, I think, in understanding sort of challenges to its work that might be coming from the information space. And it set up a board that was intended to be sort of an advisory board. The State Department has such a board. The Defense Department has such a board, not necessarily focused on information threats, but the precedent for bringing in kind of outside experts and people who watch an issue closely to give guidance to a set of executive branch officials. That's not new. I think it was politically tone deaf not to recognize the politics that exist around conversations about content moderation and about disinformation generally. And so the word governance, I think, was a terrible word to include in its title, in part because it had no governing mandate. It was sort of there to advise officials who would make decisions in their official capacity. But of course, it prompted a very predictable sort of outcry from conservatives that this is big government, sort of being arbiters of truth. So I don't think that was in fact what the institution was designed to do. And I think, its goals were entirely legitimate, but I think it was politically tone deaf. And I think just broadly, it's incumbent upon, as democracies, like think through how do we respond, sort of thinking about how to reinvigorate that public trust is so important. And so, think we should be quite thoughtful about, like, if you're going to stand up an institution like that, it probably ought to be, a civil servant who leads it, somebody with an apolitical background, somebody, maybe we want that person to serve 8-year terms so they exist, or beyond 4-year terms so they exist, sort of in that role longer than any particular administration. There's a whole bunch of ways to kind of build a safety net against not just politicization in fact, but politicization in appearance. And I think those are the kinds of measures that it's really incumbent upon leaders to consider, because otherwise these entities aren't going to be trusted, and we're going to have more episodes like the one we had. And I think it's ultimately, to the detriment of all of us, who I think would benefit from a team of people tracking this problem, advising our government. So yeah, that's how I see it.
It's interesting. I know you cover Europe as well, and you know that the European Union has actually developed a disinformation strategy, which essentially is to sort of call out Russian disinformation and sort of fact check it and say, no, this is not true, and then widely distribute kind of a newsletter about that. I mean, they seem to be able to do that. Why can't the United States do that?
Yeah. I mean, I have lots of thoughts about this. I think, you know, there's the evidence on debunking is mixed. And the source of the debunking matters, and sort of trust in that, in the authoritativeness of that source matters. And so I think there are some differences in the European and American environments about the extent to which like the public trusts the government when it talks about these issues. Case in point, the example we just talked about. So I think that's one piece of it. You know, I think there's value in sort of exposing these kinds of operations, but I guess I think we might want to disaggregate like what's the role of government and what's the role of civil society organizations. And I personally would prefer to have like civil society organizations, researchers, you know, and open source investigators, journalists being the ones who are sort of publicly debunking campaigns and contributing to public awareness and public knowledge about sort of what these sort of information adversaries are doing. And then I think there is a public diplomacy role for governments. But we want to be thoughtful about what audiences government is speaking to. And I personally think like our public diplomacy strategy should be less focused on responding tit for tat, like in kind to each individual sort of claim, mostly because there's so much whataboutism and it just prolongs the conversation on sort of Russia's terms. And instead, I think we want to zoom out and be much more thoughtful about responding by calling out the tactics, like calling it whataboutism, rather than like responding to the charge. And so I think that's a place where there's sort of some room for growth in the way our government sort of handles its responses.
I think I'll just maybe ask one more question before start turning it over to the audience for questions. So you guys all should formulate some questions. That would be awesome. But, you know, I guess Vince Lombardi, I think, was one who said, you know, or some football person brain said at one point, the best defense is a good offense, right? And in a way, I've been just listening to you here, it's sort of reminding me of that in a way, it sounds like what you're saying is democracies are handicapped in being able to play defense against these campaigns, in part because we just can't close off channels of communication in a democracy, and also because foreign disinformation is very frequently picked up by domestic actors who then, you know, add to it in important ways. And it becomes domestic, which is even, you know, even if, and frankly, everybody has free speech in these areas and can say whatever they want, right? So basically, there's no way, as you were kind of saying, similar, I mean, there's maybe a more exaggerated way to say it, but there's no way of actually defending against this thing. But you can go on the offense, right? And you mentioned a couple examples of that. One of them that I think is very interesting to think about is how the United States and also Ukraine have played offense in the information space against Russia in this current war. Has that been effective?
I think so. I mean, I think this is a great example of like persistent engagement in the information space, like using the strategy of like declassifying and exposing information, you know, in the lead up to the conflict, but not just, that sort of highlighted the ways that Russia was planning on using false flag ops, you know, to justify its invasion with lies. And I think, you know, did it prevent the invasion? No, I don't think it was ever designed to do that. But I think it made it much harder, you know, it made the hill steeper for Putin to have to climb. And I think it really set the frame through which a lot of people understand the conflict and sort of are integrating new pieces of information as they come, right? Russia is the aggressor, Ukraine is the defender. And so like when I think about the difference to 2014, for example, it's not like our government knew less about what Russia was doing, but it was barely talking to its allies, never mind, you know, talking to the public. And so I think we could see, I think there are some interesting questions about what are the limitations of that strategy. It might only be, you don't want to draw it out all the time because I think it might become less useful. But I think it was very, very effective case of sort of going on offense, working with partners. I would say, I think that it was only believed in part because it came true, and in part because there's this maturation of this OSINT community where, you know, you had satellite company, you know, Maxar providing, you know, satellite images, journalists triangulating like satellite images with, other data from, you had sort of this independent, like civil society driven sort of verification of the statements that our government was making. And I think that was just crucial to the credibility of those statements. So I don't think you can just use the strategy all the time. And I would also say it doesn't have to stop the day. Like, it doesn't have to, it's not just about the invasion itself, but like, I think the effort to sort of expose troop death numbers, for example, is also a way of sort of making, sort of getting at our advantage is that like autocrats are themselves brittle to open information. We can use that to kind of get them where it hit Putin where it hurts, right? He's worried about what his audiences at home are going to see, and I think we can just make it a little more challenging for him.
Okay, so the next board is going to be called the Disinformation Offense Board or something. In any case, I'd like to open it up to questions from the floor. I think we have a microphone that is posted way over there. So if you're over here, you have to either catch really well through the microphone or just come over here to the microphone and ask your questions. Anybody have a question? Yes. Monsieur, yes, please, over here.
Are there any acts of disinformation that Russia or China is doing that the US government is not doing or the Europeans are not doing? In a sense, what is the difference? Is the regime type making the difference, the important criteria here in terms of the approach to propaganda?
Yeah, it's a great question.
question,
Yeah. So I think there are multiple prongs of information manipulation activity. An important one is censorship. That's something that we see the Chinese government doing with ruthless efficiency that we do not. I think while sort of public diplomacy or like telling China endeavors to tell China's story well, that alone is not that's not the problem, right? We try to tell our story well, that's public diplomacy, but our public diplomacy tends to be transparent and sort of I think transparency is sort of an essential key here. I also think we've learned lessons over time. There's things we used to do that sort of meddled in the sort of domestic politics of other states that we sort of no longer see as legitimate. And I think that's we should acknowledge that, and that's okay. There's lots of things we used to do. We used to use an atomic bomb too, but we've gotten better over time. And I think when you compare sort of what's happening today, both Russia and China are using these, clandestine means to sort of stoke division, for at least in the case of Russia, from within. That's sort of not, I think, the goal of U.S. public diplomacy.
My question was actually quite similar. One of the more forceful moments of your remarks was to adamantly say that liberal democracies should not themselves be engaged in disinformation. And I was curious to hear more about what concretely that would look like. What are some specific examples, not of nuclear weapons, but of actual disinformation that historically have been used and maybe people who disagree with you would advocate for today, and maybe also give you a chance to say a bit more about what you find misguided about that approach. Is it that it's morally wrong? Is that research suggests it's impractical? So that would be my question.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. So let's talk about the French case in Africa, right? France was the first sort of liberal democratic government that platform, exposed for having used information operations in the same way. I mean, it was Meta, right? And it came out in much in the same way we're used to seeing reports on Russian disinformation. And it was an operation with a bunch of trolls that were connected to the French military that created these assets on Facebook in a handful of African countries, including the Central African Republic, right before elections there. And they it was a case of dueling trolls tangling with one another, right? It wasn't that they were engaging necessarily with African audiences, they were engaging with Russian trolls that were also operating in the same information environment. And they, basically the Russian trolls were pushing back on French foreign policy and the French trolls were sort of defending French interests, right? This seems to me to be wildly silly, right? If France was concerned about this, what they could have done was just expose what Russia was doing, to the very same audiences. They could have reached out to those audiences and said, you guys have a disinformation problem. How can we help you to build? Let's invest in your independent, media ecosystem. They could have. I think when they were exposed, it was really embarrassing. Like, part of the reason not to do it is ethical, but I think a lot of the reason not to do it is strategic. Like, we just can't do it as well, and that we face like vastly more consequential costs to being exposed for these kinds of operations, right? I mean, the previous question was like, well, how are we different? And it's really important that we can say how we're different. I mean, that is, our key strength is our soft power and our ability to sort of attract, and persuade. And so I think we just undermine, as I said, like the authority of our own institutions, the authority and resonance of our own values when we act against them, and it's not going to work. And we have other tools that are sort of available to us. And I think, ultimately what France did was kind of undermine democratic space, like in a fellow democracy. It was ahead of elections. This was sort of manipulating political discourse in another democratic country, for, I think, what kind of benefit did that really have, to sort of France's standing? And it certainly didn't have much benefit to France's standing after it was exposed.
Hi, so you've talked a lot about potential strategies that states could enact to combat disinformation, but I was just wondering, compared to something like a disinformation governance or, well, a fence board, how much power would such an institution have to combat disinformation compared to promoting digital media literacy amongst the general public?
It's a great question. So I am not opposed to digital media literacy, digital literacy initiatives, I think, are an important part of building resilience. But if we're relying on digital literacy alone to save us, if we're relying on like individuals to go up against the sophisticated intelligence services of foreign adversaries, we've kind of lost. So it's an important component of building resilience, but it's not going to be the thing that saves us. The important thing is there is no one thing that's going to save us. This is a problem to be managed, not to be, that cannot be resolved. And so, I've laid out a whole bunch of things that we can do, but I think, another is just to sort of build better connective tissue across government, because where I started was that we should understand these operations as like part of a broad toolkit and part of a broad strategy. And I'm not convinced that like parts of our government are talking to each other, right? There's great people at Treasury who track strategic corruption, but like, how well are they talking to, people who look at other forms of interference? And so, there's this effort to build a foreign malign influence center out of ODNI. I think that's great because it coordinates across the intelligence picture, but that alone is probably not going to be enough. It's important, but not enough. So I don't understand why we don't have somebody, on the National Security Council who's responsible for interference issues, among which like information threats would be one. But anyway, so I think, these kinds of boards can play an important role in like knitting together building a coherent threat picture against a challenge that's really hard to see, because by design, these tools are deniable and, these efforts are clandestine. Yeah, that's how I see it. Sure.
Thank you.
When I was thinking about why the European Union had a good strategy that you guys were talking about and why America couldn't, I can help but think about Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where I think he talks about the maverickness of like newspapers in circulation in the States, as well as the uniqueness of our two-party system. So my question was, do you think the inability of America to formulate a cohesive disinformation strategy vis-a-vis the EU might be a function of our unique two-party system? Because I think the intention of Russia, if I'm understanding correctly, is to exploit like polarizing topics in particular, right? So isn't that quite easy to do in a two-party system where it's either A or B?
Yeah, I mean, I think political polarization is the number one sort of challenge that we face, right? It's the number one obstacle to overcoming this problem because it provides so much of the fodder, on which these campaigns fester, and it keeps us from, doing the things we need to do to get our house in order. So I think that's like absolutely correct.
If digital literacy is not sufficient, where would you draw the dividing line between combating misinformation and censorship? And what is the role of corporate power in that? The example I'd love you to speak about is in 2018 for the 2018 election, when Facebook worked with the Atlantic Council to combat misinformation and removed a ton of accounts. At the Atlantic Council, which receives, hundreds of thousands of dollars from autocratic regimes like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So one, what is the line between combating misinformation and censorship? And two, insofar as there is a more active role to be played in combating misinformation, what is the role of these major corporate actors like Facebook?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think we should strike the term fake news, for example, from our lexicon, because it's not a good description of the problem, right? So much of disinformation isn't demonstrably true or false. It's sort of polarizing or misleading. And when we think about it as a fake news problem, or we think about it like fundamentally as a content problem, and I think there are some problems in the information space that are properly understood as content problems, like hate speech, child sexual, exploitative imagery, for example. These are content problems. But I think the sort of disinformation challenge it's a behavior problem. And so what we need platforms to do is police on deceptive behavior, right? So the issue, so and platforms do this, like when they're taking down accounts or they're taking down, pieces of content, at least separate from sort of certain defined categories, it tends to be because they've misrepresented who they are, because they've operated in sort of coordinated ways that were, again, violated the terms of service of the platform, right? I think that's the right approach. Now, the platforms have different terms of services because they exist to do different things. I think that's actually a strength. So Facebook, for example, requires you to be who you say you are. And if you're not, they'll take you down. There's no such requirement on Twitter. On Twitter, it's perfectly acceptable to have, a sort of a second account or a parody account. I think this is a good thing. I mean, we want places for human rights advocates, for example, like to not have to be totally transparent about who they are. But the important thing is in the terms of service kind of become the rules, they are the rules, and they become sort of the governing law. Against which we expect platforms to act. So it's important that those terms of service, you be thoughtful. And then I think what's especially important is that the platforms are transparent about what pieces of content they took down, why, sort of on the censorship question, like at the request of which government, if any, and on what basis they made their decisions. I think, we could, those spaces where we could bring a lot more transparency that I think would elevate the sense of trust in those decisions so that they're better understood. Because when Facebook currently takes down accounts and then, provides screenshots with sample content, there's not very much that like researchers that aren't funded by Facebook can do about that, or with that. But I think we are also making progress in terms of their transparency on that front.
Thank you. Chris.
With the lack of any concrete data regarding how effective the disinformation campaign happen and exactly how to what extent they have been conducted by these authoritarian states, what is a good method to convince the general public and especially the skeptics that such a governing board or an a campaign against such disinformation campaign is necessary? Because if the government or any social organization carried this out without the general public support, it could be very much feeding into the narrative that this is just a censorship campaign by the government.
It's a good question. So I think maybe two answers. So one is like what the response looks like needs to not look like a censorship campaign. I mean, it shouldn't be about policing content on the basis of content, but I don't think that's really something that anyone, is proposing. So the kinds of countermeasures, the kinds of things that can build resilience are things like media literacy. I don't mean to knock it. I just don't think it's like sufficient on its own. And advisory boards to help us see the threat picture better. These are the kinds of things that are not, about sort of taking down particular forms of content. On the, sort of with the absence of, I think there's not great data, and we won't ever have great data on how effective any particular campaign is, but the extent of the campaigns, that we have information, we have a lot of information about that. And again, I think it's really important that that's thanks to, civil society. It's not by and large thanks to government. But there's a lot of information about that. And I think that that's, important for building public understanding about the nature of the threat. And then there will always be skeptics, and that's okay too.
Hello. I'm curious if you could speak more or speak on the role of kind of other types of like infrastructure on disinformation, for example, like Chinese investment in Africa from a structural side, communication network, et cetera, and whether that is something we should can be concerned about regarding disinformation, for example, like the new IP policy or regulation that China was considering recently, and also whether or not you think that more investment from private companies in the communications networks, et cetera, from the West would combat that. I'm just thinking of other ways to think about disinformation and then like dealing with it other than just content.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's the content layer, there's the pipes that transmit information, and then there's the norms that sort of like govern all of it. And we probably need a strategy, for pushing back at sort of at each of the levels, right? And so, yes, I think, China in particular, this is a case where China and Russia are just quite different. Like China does have a strategy for sort of controlling the pipes, right? And it looks like a lot of things, but investments in digital infrastructure and in Africa and in other places, creating sort of indigenous platforms, at home that are kind of quite widely used. I mean, there are some sort of native Russian platforms, but the extent of the challenge related to China, I think, is considerably larger. And then, lots of efforts by both Russia and China to sort of shape a discourse around information sovereignty and digital sovereignty at the UN and in other fora that are, kind of, these are norm building efforts that really sort of aim to exert state control over sort of what kind of information traffics state borders. So yeah, I think we need, efforts to kind of deal with all three layers of the problem, and then to recognize that like censorship, which is what happens or what is at risk of happening when an entity like China controls the pipes, or I think that's the problem that we potentially face, is part of an information manipulation strategy.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I was very interested in hearing maybe a little bit more and an elaboration on the points you raised about a robust civil society and a free and open press. And part of that question really has to do with the coordination that happens at the US government that I'll make you partially responsible for because you know a lot. But I feel like there are these underlying conditions in the US which expose the US to disinformation campaigns. So you pointed to kind of civil society strife and the fact that in the case of Russia, just as one example, that it was able to kind of embed trolls and exacerbate and inflame discord, valid discord in the United States on race, on gender, on like any number of fissures. So one part of a government strategy could be to address the underlying conditions in the US that put it at risk for many things in and of themselves, but also at risk for authoritarian disinformation campaigns because our society is kind of so unequal in so many ways and there's so much discord right now. So what is the government thinking about in terms of those underlying conditions, and what's the coordination for kind of eliminating that opening? Similarly, I think on the press element of it, everyone you talk to will tell you obviously that there are fewer international and global correspondents, that newspapers are shrinking in different ways, and that's old media and there's new media. And I'm not a media expert, but it would strike me that more independent autonomous press can only be a good thing, and yet what we see in the US is actually the opposite. That isn't the government's concern per se, but I feel like the absence of a really robust, deep and broad media infrastructure in the US also kind of can contribute to openings in terms of disinformation campaigns.
Yeah, I think that's all right. I think what you're speaking to is this interplay between, sort of the domestic and the foreign. And I absolutely think a part of a strategy for pushing back on autocratic advances has to be to sort of close our vulnerabilities at home I think we need to do sort of three buckets of things. Like one is to sort of close our vulnerabilities to the extent that we can, and to also lean into our sort of our key sources of competitive strength. The other is to reorganize ourselves to like be sort of to meet the moment, right? That's the stuff about like organizing our government to see across the threat picture, for example. And then the third is to go on offense in the places where we're most sort of likely to succeed. In that first bucket, reducing inequality, dealing with structural racism, these are all challenges that I think bear on our ability to compete. And it's also why it's important to do that second bucket of things, which is make sure arms of government are talking to each other, because there are people doing great work in this space, but they don't necessarily see it as part of this broader competitive strategy. I also think like no matter how much progress we do or don't make on any particular issue, like an important talking point, I think about democratic societies is their ability to recognize, their failures and to self-correct, and the ability of, when Russia and China amplify, scenes of protests, for example, in the summer of 2020. I mean, they hammered that every day, and China to this day is, it's striking. And I think, again, the retort to that need not be like sort of going on, defending any individual claim, but rather like, what a great thing to have a society in which people openly protest, and and often they're right, and they get things, sort of, these are things that I think people living in closed societies fundamentally understand is not true about their own governments, and I think is also like partly something that's fundamentally threatening to autocrats. And then on the news ecosystem, I mean, I agree with you. The report that I think got circulated sort of pointed to this problem. I don't think it's a problem government can fix, but maybe philanthropists can, and maybe we as citizens, can, in the ways that we, choose to consume and invest in media.
My question's about the role of media in perpetuating disinformation. So an example is in the aftermath of Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, China did a bunch of drills. China released a bunch of images about the drills, and the one that all major media, whether it was the Washington Post or CNN, what they posted with every article turned out to be a fake picture where it was Photoshop, where it's a Chinese guy on a boat with binoculars looking, and you could see Taiwan in the background. Turns out that image wasn't real. So what responsibility does Western media in particular have in, I guess, fact-checking official government images in that regard? Because now when the DoD and the US post an image, we assume that's correct. We assume the US government isn't photoshopping things, especially when it comes to a drill. But we're taking that same standard to a country that is competing with us and trying to essentially lie about what they're doing. So how does like a CNN type actually fact check something like that may take a while, potentially a few days to a week, and they need to get these things out quickly? So what are your thoughts on that? How can CNN, Washington Post, or whatever fact check things more quickly so that way they're not ending up propagating the narrative that China wishes to portray and showing scary images that aren't true to then continue that cycle of fear about military drills?
Yeah. I think this was a learning example for the entities involved. But, I think you're pointing to a very real dynamic, which is like the pressure to publish quickly and to trust government sources. And I think what this points to is you can't trust all government sources. And I think that, but by and large, what sort of differentiates our media environment from like the state media of these actors is that there is sort of a journalist code of ethics. It does involve fact checking, and when mistakes are made, it involves like appending corrections, and we know about the fact that like that was an oops. So I think it's incumbent upon journalists not to do their very best, not to get it wrong, and then to be transparent when they do.
Hello. So I had a question about, so you mentioned before about how the French ran a campaign in Africa regarding the Central African Republic. And I was curious about the like call out method you mentioned where we kind of expose the campaign of disinformation. How do we like make that effective and actually, potentially reach as many people as the initial disinformation did? Or like, how do we provide an authority that is trusted to show that this is in fact a campaign of disinformation and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the Ukraine example is a good one, right? Like our intelligence community declassified certain information. And then because that information was declassified, like Blinken could go, Secretary Blinken could go to the UN and make a speech about it. And, and sort of news outlets had, authoritative account, to publish on their front pages. And so, how do you get it to reach different audiences? I think the first thing is to sort of produce the goods, like produce the evidence. And I think one thing our government didn't do so well, I think in the very beginning, was manage this tension between sort of wanting to protect sources and methods and not reveal too much information. I think in the very early stage, it was just like, trust us, like Russia's gonna, there's gonna be a false flag here. And I think they got better at revealing a little bit more of, sort of showing a little bit more of their homework. I think governments shouldn't be shouldn't rely too much on the authority of their sort of proclamations, because for reasons of trust. But yeah, I think that's how you do it. You expose information and you give it to the people. So in this case, like the French intelligence community could have, provided evidence and given that evidence to international media and gone to the government of Central African Republic and said, this is happening? And they could have, sort of talked about it in a press conference and tweeted about it. And through the variety of those channels, I think, there'd be some uptick or uptake in an understanding of what was going on.
I actually have one question after yours.
Oh, okay. I'll make it quick. My question is, you've been focusing on, the big players like Russia and China, but I'm wondering, is disinformation a game that small players, even non-governmental players, might still have a big impact in, or has that been closed off to smaller players as the big guys? And whether you have kind of some small players of note that we might want to be aware of who have done a great job of disinformation, even though they're, not the big guys.
Sure. No, it's a very crowded field. It continues to be a very crowded field. And there are many small players that can, use these tools to, I think, to the extent we can evaluate it, good effect. I just study Russia and China, so that's what I've talked about today. Iran, I think, is by no means a bit player. Again, I think Iran's information operations are more akin to China's to the extent that they are not about, sort of promoting or stoking internal divisions to exacerbate, to weaken democratic societies from within, but rather to shape opinions about Iran over time. They're not. I don't want to say they're not targeted to elections, because we know what happened with those Proud Boys emails in 2020. But they're about shaping views of Iran and Middle Eastern politics. But they've, like Russia, have been more willing to kind of use these sort of sharper tactics. And so I think Iran is a player to watch.
So I have a slightly long question I got to ask you, but it's kind of similar to my first question in a way. It's like, what are we really talking about actually right here with this term disinformation, right? So it seems to me that part of what you're talking about with regard to disinformation actually might be more appropriately called information, right? Information campaigns. I think you said at one point that it's not true that all this stuff that we're concerned about is wrong information. Sometimes it's correct information that's just mobilized in a certain way. So I guess the question is there a definition of disinformation separate from, say, propaganda, or separate from, say, government public diplomacy, right? Related to that what we're concerned about here, the fact that we're like losing a broader information war? Is the concern that we're being subject to covert type of information operations? Is the concern that that authoritarian propaganda plays better on social media, and so now that's a new thing? Or are we concerned about actual disinformation, right, of things that are just lies, right, that are coming out, whether they're spread by an authoritarian external government or domestic sources?
Yeah. So I prefer to use the term information manipulation, which I think encapsulates a wider variety of information manipulation, authoritarian information manipulation, because I think that they have an information strategy that, again, I think these different actors have different goals, but is about weakening competitor states from within, and about sort of reshaping global order. And I think disinformation is a piece of this, but it's only sort of one. It's only one element, right? Like it's the censorship piece, I think, is an important one. Again, malinformation strategy is also important. But I think like a definition of disinformation that I think is useful is one that does not use the term fake news for the reasons I've described, and does not sort of like describe this as sort of fundamentally a content problem, but about sort of intentionally misrepresenting a piece of content, its provenance or its intent, in order to shape discourse within a target society. That's how I would frame it.
So that's why you get to this issue of like transparency, like who is this information source, right? So is it a troll? Is it a disguised source? Is this actually a government agency, a foreign government agencies that set up this website and is pretending that it's somebody else? That's kind of why you were talking about that essentially, is because part of this is really a question of becoming more transparent. Like more transparency prevents us from becoming victimized by kind of like covert actions.
I mean, because it's in keeping with our values. Like, I mean, the problem that I described about Xinjiang, Chinese state media content surfacing very prominently for search results about Xinjiang. I don't think that it's a problem that Chinese state media show. I actually like, I'm not in favor of the bans on, on Russian state media, much as I, think it's problematic content. I don't think we should outright ban it. We certainly shouldn't outright ban it at the request of a government. I think that is fundamentally not in keeping with our values. We should label it. We should provide, context for users. Like the problem with the Xinjiang content is, I don't think that it's, I don't think it should be like the top 5 pieces of content when you're seeing 10 pieces of content, right? Because it's not like an authoritative account. So I think we want to have sort of, I think we should reasonably expect of like the platforms that they're able to provide, a quality like results page. But I don't think like stripping this content from the internet is the right answer. Also, like a lot of this content, part of the problem is like these private syndication or these non-transparent, we're talking about syndication agreements where it's the Helsinki Times that's republishing Chinese state media content and it doesn't say so. So when you go to search, you don't know what you are. So I think we should trust users. We should trust, it's not about banning this content, but about labeling it, about, like search engines already can tell when there's duplicate pieces of content on the internet and put only one in their top results. That's like what they do already. So it's not that hard to expect that like Google News should be able to identify, when it sees something published in the Helsinki Times, that this was originally appeared on, Xinhua, a publication funded by the Chinese government, period. And we can do that. So I think, demonetizing, de-amplifying, and, restoring context to users are responses that are resilience building and in keeping with our values, and ultimately, I think are the way to sort of thread the needle.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, there is a microphone. That's like, wasn't there a surrealist who said "Sasina Pan"?
We talked a little bit about civil society. What can we learn from other countries? Again, I'm going to give a Taiwan example. Taiwan is the Double Think Lab, which does a lot of good work in combating Chinese information manipulation. And you were saying earlier that you don't think that the left hand is talking to the right hand in the U.S. government. How is that conversation going, cooperating with allies and partners? Like if we can't even have interdepartmental conversations on combating these issues, what chance do we have to learn from Taiwan, which is experienced in combating Chinese disinformation, or say the Baltics combating Russian disinformation? So can you talk a little bit about what that sphere is with the U.S. cooperating or learning from other allies and partners in this?
I think it's just not just government. I think there's a very vibrant, researcher exchange network, right? Like, and so I think there are many fora, and there could continue to be more, where you get, the great folks from Double Think Lab are in the conversation with folks from the Balts and folks from the United States who are doing this research. And I would say like, we know one another too. So you can sort of say like, is this a challenge? And I don't just necessarily mean like an information challenge, but like a research challenge you guys have encountered, and how have you overcome it? So I think we're not lacking for like the network effect is not lacking, at least among the civil society community.
My question is about how feasible some of these policy prescriptions are about countering disinformation, especially with regards to social media platforms. Hypothetically, these companies have property rights over the speech that occurs on their platform. We see some people celebrate that when Donald Trump got taken off. They said, well, that's Twitter's decision, so it's not the First Amendment that rules that. If, say, Facebook says, I actually don't care about disinformation, it makes me a lot of money by giving people an echo chamber so they look at ads, or I'd actually like to cooperate with the Chinese government because that's a huge market. Is there anything left for the US government to do or for civil societies to do, or is that the ball game?
So, I mean, I think they can, but there'd be enormous market pressure on them not to, right? I think that would be a disastrous thing for Mark Zuckerberg to say. And I think civil society would be up in arms, and you'd see if you think there's a sort of sharp tooth legislative effort to break them up, a legislative movement to break them up now, there sure would be if they said such a thing. So I think that's the strength of a democratic society, is we exist in this sort of quite plural environment in which companies the platforms here are quite powerful, but they are constrained by self-interest, and that self-interest includes the views of the public and the sort of whims or otherwise of legislators.
Hi, I was wondering, is there a way for like the general public or just like voters to be involved in deciding what is and what isn't disinformation, like to be more involved? Because if labeling disinformation is something that happens without the general public, then how is that different, than what goes on in Russia or.
So I think it's again about behavior and not about content, right? It's not about saying we don't like this opinion and we like that opinion, or this is true speech and this is not true speech. And again, and like that instead, it's much more sort of tactical and direct, right? There's a set of rules about what you can or can't do on the platform. Did you violate that set of rules, right? You can't, say that you're a Central African Republican, a citizen of the Central African Republic, when you're actually a member of the French military. That's a violation of the terms of service, and the content wasn't labeled; it was just taken down on that basis.
Sorry, just to clarify that, you mentioned that earlier that on some social media platforms it's perfectly acceptable,
right,
to say you're somebody who you're not. Right, that's one of the things that always confounds me about Twitter, which I use a lot. But it's totally fine if people can say whoever they want to be on Twitter. So I guess like a follow-up question on that is, like, let's say that is it possible in a democracy to say that when a foreign intelligence service is launching an information campaign against us, that's illegal? Or should we just simply label it like, this is a foreign intelligence service who's underwritten this? I mean, like, what's...
Yeah, so I mean, when a foreign intelligence service, misrepresents who they are, like even on Twitter, you can be, you can create an account that doesn't have your likeness or your actual name, but there are still limits on the kinds of sort of coordination that you can do with other accounts. So if a foreign intelligence service is conducting an information campaign, usually like Twitter takes it down on the basis that these accounts are coordinating with one another. They're still violating sort of terms of service. I guess you could have government say it's illegal for foreign intelligence services to conduct information campaigns, but like to what end, right? The information operators aren't sitting here in the United States. I mean, I think Treasury, for example, has designated a bunch of, Russian individuals that have participated in election interference campaigns with very little hope of actually ever arraigning them. But the mere fact of having sort of, either designated certain individuals or, for the DOJ, indicting certain individuals has a transparency building effect. So I guess, from that perspective, sure. But I don't, again, know that, I'm not sure the big problem we face is that platforms aren't taking down known like known content backed by a foreign intelligence service. And again, as we've discussed, it's much more complex than that because it's actually also like just Chinese state media or Russian state media that's churning out large volumes of content, hammering in conspiracy theory, when like authoritative independent Western media, they debunk the bioweapons conspiracy theory last summer one time and moved on because they have budgets and they have audiences that they're beholden to, and these propaganda machines can continue to just churn out large volumes of content and override. So there we can't, it's not a foreign intelligence service, but we can just label that this is state backed, and I think that's enough.
But you did mention earlier also that RT and I believe Sputnik were effectively taken out of the U.S. media market, right? And
Globally
on what
demoted and
basis
taken out
was
of the
that?
European media market.
On what basis was that?
Right, I think it was a terrible decision.
But I mean, it was taken out on some legal basis. So what was the legal
No,
basis?
the European governments with like almost no transparency went to the companies privately and said, we want you to take it out. We want you to like ban the sharing of RT links no matter who shares. So like if you or I post them in Europe, and the company complied. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be, because many other governments are going to make many other requests of platforms.
But I thought in the U.S. also RT were basically banned under
No,
existing.
so both Facebook and Twitter have globally demoted RT and Sputnik posts, which means that they're not going to be like recommended to you in your timeline. But they're not banned. They're banned in Europe. And on
presumably also Google News and other.
And then Google News has stripped. So not Google Web Search, but Google News has stripped RT and Sputnik from its news results.
And what about for broadcast? Can they have broadcast stations and that kind of stuff?
There are all kinds of like FARA laws where they have to sort of be like openly declare themselves to be an agent of a foreign government. But my understanding is that they can still broadcast the United States, but they need like broadcast partners to do that. And this is another case where I think it's like a better response is sort of the wisdom of broadcast partners not to be like promoting content. And that's where I think like transparency can help people make better decisions about whether they want to be promoting that content rather than like government bans.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Would it be appropriate in this forum to discuss Russian propaganda and misinformation within Ukraine and Russia itself in the context of the Ukrainian invasion?
Yeah, sure.
So not to bore you with too much context, but I have former coworkers who have fought in Ukraine, specifically during the siege of Kiev, and they witnessed the civilian bombings of Irpin. And when they speak with Russian family, friends, and colleagues, there's just almost a blindness. There's no willingness to actually believe these firsthand accounts. So how does the US, or I guess the Western world, combat or maybe aggressively break through this wall that is the Russian almost iron curtain in a sense without potentially engaging in something like cyber warfare?
I think we just have to acknowledge the limits of like what we can do, right? I mean, or what we can expect of our government, and then not go farther than that, like not do something. So I think, our government can make its best effort to sort of share truthful messaging in ways that are, and they should be thoughtful about endeavoring to make that messaging compelling. We should probably be having more, we have some of the best content creators like anywhere that sit in LA. Like, are they talking to Washington about how to like craft public diplomacy messages that can be sort of, that can break through? So I think, I don't want our government to just like give up and say we'll never pierce that curtain. But I think there are, we can also recognize limits, to which like it'll be possible to shape, discourse within increasingly closed spaces.
May I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Is there anything, I guess, almost like the World War II version of leaflets over Japan or radio free
Yeah,
Europe?
well, we're moving radio towers closer to Russia. Like we're back to some Cold War tactics. We're moving like VOA radio towers closer to Russian territory. We are, there's some question about whether we should be handing out VPNs, for example. That's kind of or helping, people in closed spaces circumvent the the bans that their governments impose on them. That's kind of a next generation attempt. And then, I think part of the issue is like also these propaganda apparatuses tweet like 1,000 times a day, and our government makes one statement once and maybe tweets it out once and thinks it's like got it covered. So I think, the sort of the analogy of like the leaflets is like, you don't just like drop one leaflet. You need to actually have like a strategy. So I think, we could also do a little bit better about in that regard.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think we'll deal with these questions, the people in line, and then we'll probably draw to a close, but yeah.
I'll keep my question pretty quickly then.
It's okay, you don't have to be
Are there any worries about how misinformation can kind of exacerbate security dilemmas between two states or numerous states?
Yeah, I think we're sort of in the societal security dilemma, right? Because when you think about it, so the New York Times, investigations of corruption at the highest levels of the CCP, that's enormously threatening to the Chinese Communist Party. And it wasn't a decision that was made by our government. It was just us doing what we do, being who we are, being an open society. And I think we are inherently threatening, to the autocrats generally and the Chinese government specifically for that reason. And then this prompts them to take action, that has spillover effects for us. So, increasing their use of digital repression that has spillover effects for us. It threatens our way of life and the way that so we're each threatening to one another, I think without by being who we are without sort of intending to be. So I would characterize this as like, people ask me all the time, like, is this a new Cold War? And I think it's a sort of a societal security dilemma.
I guess this will be the last question, so hopefully it's a good final question. I want to think about expanding the conversation about the impact of these, you called it information
manipulation.
Information manipulation campaigns, not just in the US and Europe, but also globally, and thinking about what role supranational institutions or networks can have beyond kind of ad hoc information sharing between intelligence services or the EU passing rules kind of in the shadows or in the open that only apply to Europe. Like what, perhaps a UN response won't be particularly robust or dynamic, but is there a role for these international institutions in this, or smaller international institutions, or just generally these networks?
Yeah. So, I mean, Russia and China, as I've said, are sort of engaged in this norm building effort at the UN. I think an interesting question is like, how do democracies push back on that? And I'm not sure that it's at the UN, actually. I don't think that that's a forum that's particularly conducive to sort of liberal democratic interests. But then the question is, okay, well, what is the right forum? And I just don't know. So if you have a good answer to that question, I would love it. I think these institutions, as you have alluded to, represent networks, and those networks are powerful. And I don't think any one solution is the answer, but the collection of efforts by all of these bodies together is sort of like building the safety net that I think, sort of together can have a positive impact.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you so much, Jessica
guys.
Brandt, for leading a fantastic discussion here about authoritarian information manipulation. And I've really enjoyed, by the way, reading all the works that you have, many of them posted on your webpage at Brookings Institutions. Highly recommend those to people in the audience who want to learn more about different aspects of this. And thank you for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me. It was a treat.
really
Thanks so
cool.
much.